Hello everyone, this is Lomi and today we're making a super tiny dress. It's actually so small that it's not something I can recommend to anyone new to sewing. It's not a difficult pattern, but working with such small pieces can be a big challenge. One upside is that you can use tiny scraps of fabric to make this. You can probably tell the skirt piece I have is recycled material. The first thing to do is treat the edges of the fabric to ensure the material won't ravel. These pieces are so small that finishing the edges with thread isn't practical. I'm trimming my edges with pinking shears, but you can also use fray check or fabric glue on the very edges of the material to prevent it from shredding while you sew. This tiny facing piece will go on the bodice with right sides together, and then we'll sew up the back and around the neckline by hand. The seam allowances on this have to be super small, even less than 1/4 of an inch. I've marked it on the pattern so you can see how tiny the stitches need to be. That's why I sew the facing by hand. It's easier to control, and a normal running stitch is fine. You'll need to snip the curve around the neckline with scissors, cutting from the edge almost to the stitching, so that this tiny seam will lay flat. Then you'll want to make sure the new allowance is finished too. If you used fray check, it's already done, but I'm using pinking shears on the back. We wouldn't want this to ravel when we pull on it. If the facing doesn't turn nicely to the inside, you'll need to go back and clip your seam until it does. It's hard to get this to look good in small scale, but keep at it. You'll want to use an iron to press it nice and flat once it's turned, and it'll look something like this. Make sure it flexes nicely, then we'll work on the sleeves. I finish the end of the sleeves with pinking shears, and then fold the sleeve to the inside. It'll be a straight line, even with the raw edges of the body. I know that looks wrong right now, but trust me, it'll work out perfect in the end. To get clean corners on the skirt without a lot of bulk, turn the corner in diagonally, and then fold the side and bottom edge in to create a nice mitered corner on the hem. This is way smoother than trying to fold one side over the other. Then sew the hem by machine for a neat finish. We'll sew the sleeves down this way too, just sewing the tiny folded sleeve down on itself. Clip your threads so you don't get tangled up in these tiny seams. Then fold either side of the bodice so the right sides of the material are together. You'll have a sleeve opening on either side, and the back center will be open too. I'm sewing the sides shut by machine, but you may find it easier to do by hand. Backstitching at both ends, sew up the side of the body and just a little bit past the bottom edge of the sleeve's hem. You'll turn at a right angle and sew out to the tip of the sleeve, creating an L-shaped line of stitches. I do the same thing on the other side, but start at the sleeve and then sew down the side of the body. I was concentrating so much on keeping my seam allowance tiny that I almost forgot to backstitch at the start of the seam. Backstitching creates locked stitches that won't ravel easily, which is important for keeping the sleeves from coming apart when dressing your doll. I'll use pinking shears on these seam allowances too. It's so tiny that I have to be extra careful not to cut too hard or I might mess up the material. It makes it tricky with pinking shears, which can be hard to cut with in the first place. As this is now, there's not enough give in this tiny seam to let this sleeve flip right side out. So we'll create the room we need by taking our scissors and cutting at an angle up into the very corner of the seam we've created, almost to the stitches. This will allow the sleeve to move freely. I do the same thing on the other side, just in reverse order, clipping at an angle into the armpit and then trimming the allowance. Then I turn the bodice right side out, using a paintbrush handle to turn the sleeves. Next, I'll gather the skirt. I use my sewing machine to put a series of long stitches along the top edge of the skirt. Then I grab one thread and pull, gathering the material onto it. These threads will get in the way as you sew, but it's very important not to cut them yet, or your gathers will come undone. Then pin the bodice and the skirt with right sides together, lining up the raw bottom edge of the bodice with the raw top edge of the skirt. I like to pin the ends together first, then adjust the gathers as needed to make sure everything is smooth. They're pretty close to the same size, so it just needs a little adjustment. Flicking the sharp end of a pin over the gathers will help smooth them out and distribute them evenly. Once it's thoroughly pinned, I take this to the machine and sew the skirt and bodice together, backstitching at both ends and being careful to take out all the pins. You might have noticed I started with the needle down that time. I find that helps me get started with the fabric right up against the needle. For something so small, which is easily sucked into the machine if it's not in the right place, this makes it easier for me. But your machine might be different. Then I go back over the edges of the fabric with a zigzag stitch to finish it. This is the only place you can get away with finishing by machine on this dress. Trim all your threads and then take a look at the dress. Depending on how much it's handled and the type of fabric being used, the facing might not want to stay to the inside. If yours refuses to stay down like mine now, you can use a hand needle to put some tiny stitches along the top edge to hold it. Once it's laying nicely, you can add your back closure. I like to use Velcro for these because there's so little room, and snaps add a lot of bulk. Finally, you can finish your dress by decorating with ribbons, lace, or tiny buttons. I add a blue ribbon sash with a bow on the front. If you opt to add a ribbon like this, which will tie in the back, make sure you only sew it to the front of the dress, since the back overlaps itself to close. I find it's really only necessary to stitch it in 2 places, once under each arm. Now you can see the finished dress on my doll. The back closes without a lot of bulkiness, which I like. And even though it's a simple dress, it's as cute as can be. And that's it for today. If you use this pattern to make something, I'd love to see. So make sure you drop a link below or share it on Instagram with the hashtag Lomi Tutorials. Thanks for joining me again. Bye!